Welcome to the first of a series of lectures we're doing this week on various aspects of international education in higher education. On behalf of the Centre for Academic and Professional Development, I'm very pleased to welcome this evening Professor Miri Rubin, who is going to talk to us about medieval universities, privileged, distinctive and embedded. Miri is Professor of Medieval History, Head of our School of English, and a distinguished historian of the medieval period. Looking very much forward to hearing what you've got to say about medieval universities.
Thank you. I'll try and make it relevant, particularly because our principal is here, so I want him to go away developed and improved, as it were. No, obviously, a medievalist who's asked to talk to non-medievalists is always very keen to show just how absolutely cutting edge and relevant we are, aren't we? I'm talking now to the PhDs in medieval history there, and that our conversations can link up. And actually, when we talk about universities, it's a very easy job because everyone knows that the universities are a medieval invention, creation, evolution. What we make of that fact is, of course, a question, what does that really mean? The fact that they sort of began around the end of the 12th, early 13th century. What do we owe to the models developed then? Some universities benefit enormously from the existence of fabric. I happen to live in Cambridge. I was educated there. It's just all around, so much so that funding formulas have to be found in the treasury. How do you sustain a university that also has very, very old buildings to maintain? And, in other places, that antiquity is also marketed as a sign of quality. We know at Queen Mary that the relationship between antiquity and quality is an extremely complex one, and one that always has to be proven because the new and the dynamic and the engaged with contemporary issues produces an excellence all of its own kind. But I still think, nonetheless, that because quite a lot of the patterns of organization, let alone the actual language that we use to describe, still was born in the Middle Ages. The question is, why does there seem to be this sort of continuity, this utility, this usefulness of a model of education that was not only created in the Middle Ages, but actually even in the Middle Ages was based on a model that was classical. So we're talking going back over 2,000 years in terms of the ideas of of what makes an academic education, what makes an education. So I thought that I would pull out a few questions that are always with us. And that's what's really interesting about what we'll try and do here, I hope, is that we will look at some fundamental questions that we are dealing with in higher education, and you will see the ways at least how a particular culture over a number of hundreds of years engaged with it. And I shall add also that medieval universities is extremely misleading because very quickly you will see there are a number of models, even at the time, but also different variations across Europe in terms of how to deploy those models. But I think it's just useful to remember that the fundamental questions are, if education of young adults is an important thing, and of course in the period I'm talking about is only men, then is it right that those who benefit should be the ones who pay for it? And who are the ones who benefit? Are the beneficiaries the people themselves who gain the skills and the prospects that are attached to them? Is it the people who will then employ them and benefit from the skills that they've acquired? So those are questions that are absolutely there in terms of the different funding models that prevail in the Middle Ages, as we will see. Then the question is, how do you turn what is taught in a classroom, in a university classroom, into something really useful? So what's interesting, as you will see, there's a lot of knowledge out there in the Middle Ages, knowledge of craft, of art, of skills of accountancy, knowledge about trade and so on, which now we cover in our universities, but which were not considered material for university education. There were other arrangements, and that's another important thing, that because of the primacy of universities now, when we talk about universities in the past, we expect that to be the case. It is not. It was not. The universities were there to provide particular distinctive training, which you'll see in a minute what that was. There are lots of other places. So if you wanted to be even a very, very important lawyer in England in the 15th century, you went to the Inns of Court to pursue a particular type of career. And for another career in the law, you would actually go to university. And employability, we use the word employability, but employability then as now is of course associated with networks of patronage, with who knew whom and who could offer jobs at the end. And student support, again related to the issue of funding the university itself, but also individuals, how to combine and how to support them financially, but also how to support them at a really, really formative age. Universities were terrifically obsessed with the issue of securing supplies of food to university cities, but also the whole issue of morality and corruption. You know, these boys coming from the countryside into the city. Paris was famed for its many tens of brothels that just around the university quarter and so on. So the issue of what type of special responsibility you have in a higher education, in a university, because you are dealing with people that even in the medieval period would be considered, still young, still needing nurture, needing protection, and so on. And of course, in the presence of men who are significantly older and more powerful than them. So the whole issue, well, the issues are evident. Then there's also the grappling with the issue of where is useful stuff done and where is the theoretical blue sky thinking done. Not all universities offer the whole array. There was something a little bit less respectful and less respectable and less prestigious about, say, being a surgeon who actually cut people and healed people and touched people than being the physician who only learns about such people and the making of the body and health and has interesting ideas about how to develop health, but never actually lays hands on individuals. And again, arising and concerned also with some of the earlier points, is higher education also about instilling some sort of moral good? Does it have to go? Can you teach really, really interesting materials that might be actually, detrimental to the moral development of an individual? And to what extent, then, is higher education a stage absolutely necessary to get on in the world, to make the right sort of connections, and so on? So in different parts of Europe, different answers were given to these questions, and also different types of populations went to university, and that I hope will unravel in what follows. But just to remind you that the education provided in universities in the Middle Ages was a set of generic transferable skills. So it wasn't so much about learning a lot of content, but it was learning how to do things. And what I mean is that in the Middle Ages, the prevailing, the most powerful, the most prestigious educational system was that inherited from antiquity, and it's known as, of course, the set of the liberal arts. And in a way, thousands of institutions in the United States still follow the model whereby in the first 4 years, like many of our associates who come here, they're not specializing in particular as yet in anything. They're doing a lot of different things with a lot of different types of learning that will develop in them basic skills. And then if they want to be an architect or a lawyer or a doctor, that will be a postgraduate experience. So in a way, that is exactly the medieval model. So these 7 arts that are considered fundamental, that everyone and anyone has to have them if they will be effective in the world. And remember, this is inherited from classical antiquity. So we're talking if you're going to get up and be an orator in the Senate in Rome, if you're going to be a poet, if you're going to negotiate treaties, if you will argue effectively, forensically in court, these are the skills you have to have. So it envisages a free-born, privileged man as the deployer of these 7 liberal arts. And they're divided into 3 and 4. Grammar, literally, the art of constructing an effective sentence. Rhetoric, it's the art of constructing sentences that will actually compel and persuade those who listen to them. and logic, that is, making infallible arguments, arguments that cannot be faulted. Really, really important. Well, if you just stop for a minute, this is really what we try to get our students to learn. The quadrivium, the set of 4, are arithmetic. Everyone and anyone should be numerate. Geometry. Everyone and anyone should be able to explore the world as a set of relationships in space. Music. It goes without saying, perhaps, or it did then. And astronomy, really, really important in terms of building up calendars, when you can't just sort of look them up on your sort of iPad or on your phone, looking into planning into the future through observation of the planets. So it has its, of course, its twin astrology, which is a total no-no, and you shouldn't go there because that is trying to sort of divine and abuse, as it were, astronomy. So these, you'll notice immediately that there's no question here of arts or sciences. This is all a set of knowledge, set of skills by which you can explore the world, affect the world, and write about the world, and discuss the world, and penetrate the world. And these go together, because to observe and to discuss, you need all these 7 types, 7 groups of skills. So in the Middle Ages, and this is a very interesting process, which is not for now, around the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, the period in which the Roman Empire became Christian, and Europe became more and more parts of Europe became Christian, even beyond what had been the Roman Empire. Through that process, it became absolutely clear that the knowledge of classical antiquity, the education, the academic system, was absolutely crucial for Christian culture as well, and it was preserved. It was preserved even with the fall or the diminution of institutions in the Roman Empire due to invasions and political upset. Nonetheless, there were still institutions, monasteries, cathedrals, and collections of very rich, great individuals where manuscripts were copied, where knowledge was disseminated, where little schools were had in order to preserve and to use this knowledge. And by the 11th century, somewhere like Chartres in the north of France, celebrated on its facade, you see there Chartres and the facade I'll be talking about in a minute, these sort of by the carvings there, as you see, is a celebration of this knowledge. So you'll see there dialectic, that's logic, rhetoric, geometry, and each one interspersed with one of the great geniuses in it, like Aristotle and Cicero and Euclid, etc. So this is absolutely the system of knowledge that prevails. And it's sometimes associated, as I said, to learn is painful. So the symbol for grammar, she's always there chastising her pupil and it's not just that it's painful and it's a slog, it's also that pain has a sort of mnemonic value to it. What you're going through pain, you remember, or so it goes. And so that's also very interesting when you think of forms of pedagogy, how people were taught. The teaching of music, for example, was related particularly to sort of markings of the fingers. And I actually remember my ballet teacher used to castigate me with a stick on my feet. So there's obviously a long tradition in believing this. But here it is also displayed, and it's interesting that Grammatica. And here again, it's like, this is a 15th century image just showing you've got those 3 sort of language and persuasion arts, which are at the top, the ladies at the top. And they're dragging the cart. In the cart you see sort of the Virgin Mary sitting there, and you see an image of Christ. So as it were, the whole Christian project has to be pulled and supported by these 7 liberal arts. And so if we look just at a very nice section of Europe, northern France, just if you just look into it, just that section there, look how many and in what proximity in the Ile-de-France around Paris, how many institutions they were. Not one of them is a university as yet. So there's quite a lot of learning going about in these centers. Monasteries took in students as well as educating their own, and cathedrals, of course, were in cities, so there's no question of their separation in the countryside like monasteries were, and they educated clergy and also took paying people to be educated because there was demand for education, and we'll see why, particularly in this period, because the 11th and 12th centuries, sort of the period of 1000 to 1200, is of massive economic growth, demographic growth, which leads to urbanization, commercialization. This is the birth of the sort of the Europe as we know it. A lot of it happens then, a lot of the new cities and institutions, and also what are coalescing are in states, these sort of dynastic kingdoms, and in Italy, of course, there are some also very important city-states. All of these need management. All of these needs clerks and recorders and people who can maintain records, communicate, argue, all the skills that I've just described to you, let alone the geometry and the mathematics and so on that goes into actually building buildings, and let alone the music that goes into the preparation of the liturgy and the worship that unfolds in these buildings. So all these, the curriculum, the classical curriculum, is extremely useful, and it becomes particularly in demand with this economic growth. So there's the wherewithal, and there are those who are ruling and developing more and more sophisticated systems of rule. Even if all what you have is a little bit of English history, this is of course the period that leads up to Magna Carta, dare I say. So it's a very, very sophisticated political culture that is associated with writing, with documents, with law, with the interpretation of law, with the provision of courts, of course in this country common law and equivalently otherwise. That is why we need so much higher education in this period. So some of the considerations as to where to do this sort of education are, is teaching and learning a craft? It should be organized perhaps in a guild, because there is a very good model for educating and training apprentices, say skinners or carpenters or bakers or butchers. That is the guild system, that you learn as an apprentice on the job. If it's an art or a service, like a great, maker of stained glass, then maybe it should be organized in courts. We have a patron, you have a few people around who work and train the young ones. Is that a model that's efficient and effective to provide these services now needed? And there are clearly some absolutely brilliant teachers, and we are very good at rewarding them and recognizing them here at Queen Mary, I'm happy to say. But, having a good teacher and people flocking to learn with a particular teacher, how do you turn that into something accreditable? That'll be familiar to us, right? How do you turn that into something where people have a degree, so if they go to a different country, a different city, they can say, hey, I have this training, I can actually do the job. So there are all these issues that arise as these as this sector really becomes more buoyant, and demand for higher education becomes greater and greater. And two models that arose in particular are the Parisian, Northern European, Bolognese, Southern European, and even they have various models in their adoption. So in order to understand the context of the emergence of the Paris model, we go to Paris and we go to Notre Dame Cathedral, and as I said, like all cathedrals, had its own school to train its own priests, it's people who celebrate the liturgy, and to train some people also from the city. But it's an ecclesiastical institution, don't forget, so it's all done within the administration of the cathedral, and the person who was in charge of providing or supervising the education was called chancellor. Hence we have the title chancellors and vice chancellors in our university system. Still, it wasn't his only job. He was also in charge of money and income and many other important things, but that was also his job. And those of you who know Paris and know Notre Dame, be reminded that this great big opening in front of it, the wonderful square in front of it that you see now, the Parvis Notre Dame, was created in the 19th century. Before, it was just a warren of streets and whatnot, and besides the prostitutes that were in the area, there were also a lot of booksellers, as you can imagine. Indeed, a whole industry of copying of books as well. So the Paris model is teacher-led. That is to say, ultimately, a bunch of teachers that were around in Paris in various places, like, for example, if you just follow the PowerPoint there were some in a number of monasteries. There were some, of course, in the royal court. This is the capital city. There were some just masters who simply charged for their lectures, found a space to teach, like Peter Abelard, we'll return to him in a minute, and taught there. So there are different types of provisions, some of them in well-established institutions, some of them not. and it's drawing people into the city. And this becomes an issue. Where do they live? How do you police them? Young men, I don't have to tell you, it's a bit of a problem. And so the teachers actually get together and seek permission from that Chancellor of Notre Dame to organize themselves as a sort of guild. So it starts from just being really quite dispersed learning, and it turns into what will ultimately be the university. And just to show you here this image of medieval Paris, and you see all these different places where learning was possible, from the south with Sainte-Geneviève and Saint-Victor to Notre Dame bang in the center, and all the other institutions around, lots and lots of religious institutions, each of them but not able to provide. Religious institutions are meant to take in students as a matter of course and feed them and so on. Hence there was a space for some sort of organization at this moment, and that is what was organized. So the lecturers get together and they organize a curriculum, and they seek approval from the bishop and his chancellor, and basically what they do is they read great texts. I mean, still in Oxford the classics degree is called great texts in lecture form. Okay, and as you can see, as usual, some are more interested, some are less interested, some are taking notes, some are dreaming, some are sleeping, so that what is new. So just to recapitulate then, that we have a number of really, really charismatic teachers, absolutely European leaders in education. There's a reputation. The reputation leads to people coming in large numbers. Something has to be done because Notre Dame is sort of, obviously the bishop's seat. It's expected that a sort of ecclesiastical leadership and leadership in issues of education will be offered from there. But there are endless controversies as to what should or should not be taught, as you can imagine. But what's important for us here is that this is a model of a university which is organized around the teachers. And that is a very, very strong model. In fact, it's the most prevalent model of a university. So the Senate, or in whatever it's called in different places, the congregation in Cambridge, is that of the teachers, not of the students, okay? And what they do is set a number of texts that are core texts that have to be learned, studied with a teacher, and the teacher comments on them. And it's not so much about originality, and it's not so much about people writing extraordinary, innovative pieces of research. They don't write at all. It's all about reading and disputation, Hence we get within this system the emergence of dialectic, or what is known usually in a bad way as scholasticism, that is a sort of a style of learning that's all about opposition. If you want to know what the nature of God is, then you imagine what the world would be without God. Okay? That's the way you argue, yes or no. In fact, Peter Abelard's most famous book was called Sic et Non, yes and no. But it's sort of scary if you have people who are asking questions whether God exists, or what is the nature of God, and is the Trinity not the Trinity, or what. Hence, the issue of academic freedom is always extremely vexed in these universities, because on the one hand, the prestige of having papal approval is absolutely fundamental if you're going to train all these people, many of them will go into the church. And while they are students in the University of Paris under this emergent dispensation, they also have to live as if they are in religious orders. They have to have a tonsure. They have to wear a clerical garb, which gives us our clerical garb that we wore for so many hours last week. So what also remains from that form of organization is the idea that certain subjects ought to be really clustered in faculties, as they are here. So there's the faculty of theology, mother of sciences, in that system, of canon law, of the law of the church, of medicine, and of the arts. The arts, you know what that is, the University of Paris. But also, interestingly, when you're putting people together to live together and to act together, you list them actually by the nation. People want to cluster French with French, and Norman with Norman, and Picard and English and German were stuck together. And for some reason, Cecil, the Spaniards were always put together with the English. I'm not sure why, maybe you know. But it doesn't seem an obvious combination. So we see the beginning of this sort of familiar set of organizations that are still with us. The term university comes from the word universitas, which means a corporation. It's like a guild. It's when people with the same skills or the same aims come together to create a strong association that represents their interests. Okay. And some other terms that are still used by us is the faculty. It's the dean, the person who supervises the delivery of the teaching, is the rector, who's more in charge of sort of behavior and conduct, and the lectura, which is usually a commentary on an authoritative text, and we can look at it sort of that way as well. So at each one of these sort of national associations also had somebody at its head, because of course this is a hierarchical system necessarily. And just to show you the development of colleges, what are colleges? Colleges are foundations that some rich person or important person, in this case Robert de Sorbonne, endows and creates in order to place within it a privileged group of students. But most students just had to find their own accommodation, their own food, their own place to live. So some economic opportunities were recognized by entrepreneurs or just townspeople, and they developed halls. That's how we get the term halls of residence. This is basically some building somewhere, some space with a lot of beds in it, and basically renting them out, and people live together in really quite cramped situations. Those who belong to colleges were much more privileged, because obviously these are endowed institutions. So the connection between penury and student life is a very strong and long-standing one, and there is a formulary, a sort of a book of forms of how to write good and effective letters from the 14th century, and there are some models about how to write begging letters to relatives or various people within one circle if you are a student. And but then there was also another model, which is sort of interesting to think about, just in order to say it wasn't absolutely obvious to all that a university has to be organized by those who provide the teaching. Because in Bologna, which is a very important city that has a lot of vestiges of autonomy in the Middle Ages, although like most Italian cities, it was actually formally under the rulership of the Holy Roman Empire, he who ruled more or less the whole of sort of Germany and eastern France and northern Italy and Switzerland of today. So in Italy, what's very striking is that the traditions of education from late antiquity, from the Roman Empire, never quite diminished as much as they did elsewhere. You could still go to cities, I don't know, the 7th or 9th century or the 11th century and get a good education. There were schools. But it had particularly strong traditions in Roman law, in the Bologna model. And Roman law is extremely important, not only because it deals with everything, but also because even ecclesiastical law, the law of the church, used the jurisprudential principles of Roman law. So Roman law, absolutely crucial. And even in England, where common law developed, it was also very much influenced by the principles of Roman law, which is a comprehensive, very long-standing, highly articulated, highly complex, much commented upon a system of law. And who is interested in there being experts in the law? Of course, the emperor himself, who wants to see his cities flourishing. Flourishing cities pay taxes. Flourishing universities in cities will produce servants that will offer, a good administrative sort of provision for the imperial court and everything that it provides. So we find, therefore, that actually it's the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick, who provides the first sort of recognition of Bologna as being something like a university, an universitas, a corporation, but he provides it actually to the students, because students were coming from all over Europe, and particularly from Germany, that is, from other parts of his own domain. And in order to encourage them, he gave them various privileges, and that is why privileged in my title. So privileges, for example, to be exempt from all sorts of impositions, taxes related with travel, with entry and exit from cities, and he was able to do so because he was the overlord of this whole region. The freedom of the clergy, that is, that they can't be tried by any court except for a church court, and various privileges such as that. And University of Bologna is very beautiful. So, as I say, church law and Roman law were the absolute expertise of Bologna, and people came from all over Europe to study exactly those subjects, not so much theology as in Paris. And I brought you this image just so you see what the work is like. So there'll be a section of law. And then you see here all these, in smaller script, even those who can't see very much, you see all these commentaries. The law grew through the commentary of those who studied it upon it. So if there was a very important, influential master, well, there were many in Bologna, you're sitting at their feet, you're at the cutting edge, you're hearing the most relevant and enlightening commentaries, well, you'll want to come to Bologna, and you'll get a very good job afterwards. So student power, empowering the students to then hire the teachers. So they want to come because there is an availability of good teachers, like you might go to a city because there's an availability of good painters. So this model of sort of going and hiring the teachers is very different from the emphasis in Paris. I hope you'll agree. So the lectures could be fined for various, misdemeanors. They were fined if they came in late. They were fined if they didn't organize their lectures properly so that they would get through the curriculum, finish the text by the end of the year. If they were too slow, too fast, if they don't manage to attract students, they get fined for that as well. I'm happy that we don't do that in the School of History, but it happens very rarely. There's also this chap called the lupus, the wolf, who goes around spying on lecturers. They literally are servants. I mean, in a way, reflecting what had been the case actually in Rome, in Greece and Rome, where the teachers were sort of tutors, were servants. They were slaves sometimes, and unfree. So I'm very happy, I must say, that this is not a model that on the whole prevailed. But it's interesting to be aware of it, because what we see is that when institutions develop, people need models. Nothing comes out of nothing. So in the Italian cities, clearly the model of sort of you go and you hire in the city the person who can provide the best service, and it's money economy, you pay, you buy, it all seemed to work, at least in Bologna, under the patronage of the emperor. And lectures look very much like they do today, I suppose, and as we see, all the different types are there, even those who are asleep. And just also to remind you that as universities develop, so do their records, so does the administration, and don't we know about it here in every university, but just to say, keeping track, this is the list of the students of law in the 12th century. It's from the archives of the University of Bologna. I mean, that's not nothing. You need somebody who writes, and it's very nicely written out, takes the notes, copies it out fine. So administration of universities becomes another sector related to higher education. So these models existed. So if you can see from where you are, you'll see that there are precious few red squares, but then there start to be more and more in the 14th century, particularly those blue triangles. So these models then were copied. But it's not easy to found a university. It's not easy at all. If you go for the Parisian model, which is a sort of clerical university with strong theology faculty, you have to have papal approval. You have to have papal approval for it, and you have to have the personnel to teach, to ensure that you can deliver the curriculum. But what's very, very striking is the great explosion in the late 14th and 15th centuries, a great explosion of new institutions. And just keep your eye on that, because we'll return to it. So there's a beginning of university life. There's education that's provided in other ways, but clearly it is a winning formula. It becomes the most prestigious. It attracts the best teachers. and then attracts also students who become in turn extremely influential people. I mean, in 12th century, before there was a university in England, everyone went to Paris. Practically all the bishops of England spent some time in Paris, very formative years. And then, of course, there they met all the other guys from all over Europe who are going to be similarly bishops. So it was very, very easy for people to move around. And, of course, they had one language in which all this learning was done, which was Latin. So there's a real European market, in a way, in higher education at this level, and the prospects are also pan-European. If you're educated in Paris, you can go anywhere to pursue your to fulfill the promise of your education. Okay, so as we know, in England, and we're in England, we ought to talk about it a bit. The Paris model was adopted in Oxford. Again, it's a city, unlike Cambridge, it was a proper city, very very close to a lot of important royal residences, so there were enough places to put up the students, enough people to bring in the food that fed the students, because you have to have some basic infrastructure in order to even begin to claim being a university. And they got the recognition, they got papal recognition as well, and they also got a series of royal privileges. And this is really, really important, because universities, rulers loved universities. They loved universities because it trained in a predictable manner cadres of people who will go into the civil service, okay? They trained them in law, they trained them in writing, in drafting, in argument, in everything that you need in an administration. So royal privileges, enormous amount of royal privilege was sort of, showered upon universities. There was control of the price of foodstuff, there was control of rent that could be charged in the university cities, and this self-rule, as I said earlier, the chancellors of Cambridge and Oxford had their own courts. So if you're a student and you've killed a townsperson, that townsperson cannot go to the royal court to seek redress. That is massive. It's really massive. It's also it's frustrating. And that's why there was so much violence over the centuries over these issues of jurisdiction. And then in the 13th century, towards the second half of the 13th century, there develops this very, very distinctive and still very distinctive form of living, which is the colleges, endowed by important individuals, bishops, aristocrats, kings, and so on, in order to ensure that if these people will come and work for them, if they need their skills, well, let them study in an environment that's most conducive to their education. A good place, with a library, with a chapel to keep them on the straight and narrow, and then, of course, what develops is this tutorial system whereby the older students will help the younger students, and that's the secret of this distinctive form of education that is still there. So just literally, don't have to remember these facts at all, but just to show you how every king of England practically developed or created a college, or every solvent king, I should say, and bishops too. And of course, we are talking about a very Christian society, so there's a library, but there's always a chapel, and there's also this promise of prayers flowing from these very grateful students. But until the 17th and 18th century, this was a tiny minority. Only about 5% lived in these institutions. But what's strong about the college institutions is that they were endowed, so they were continuous. If your hall of residence, burns down, that's that. There is no hall of residence, but the colleges had this constant stream of support, or the business was there to stay forever. And that is why they have endured, their books have endured, they only accumulate and accumulate more. To those who have, more is given. Like there, the chapel of King's College in Cambridge, which is really a chapel for prayer in memory of one sole man, King Henry VI. But it's still there, and it's a sort of machine of music and liturgy and tourism and whatnot. So this continuity of assets is extremely interesting. So to go back to that map then, what we find then, that as European dynastic kingdoms are, develop their and England was quite precocious here, it has to be said, develop their aspirations in terms of the types of administrations that they offer, the areas of life that they control, moving more and more, for example, into regulation of trade, of commerce, taxation, of various kinds, new forms of taxation, indeed sort of income tax from the late 13th century and so on. You just need many more people to administer. So we see that happening then with new foundations in France, in England and Spain. We see in the 15th century in Italian cities their own universities, and then the Holy Roman Empire, which is a great agglomeration of many small territories in the 15th century, there every prince, every duke wants to have his university too. So it also does sort of develop a certain element of sort of competition and prestige as well. If you're at all a serious prince, you will have your musician, and you will have your university, and you will have all these activities going on. So universities began to vary enormously in the degree of their sort of let's call it pan-European universal experience, really, that people had in them. If you went to Paris, if you went to Oxford, if you went to Bologna, yes. But, you know, if you went to, I don't know, I don't want to insult anybody here, Greifswald, it will be a little bit different. So they become sort of like, you know, more local universities are training local people for local administration. But still, it does attract people from across Europe. You're not meant to absolutely learn those or know those. Just notice there are lots and lots and lots of 15th century universities. And this is a really rather nice picture which shows you that it's still the Pope, he on the left with the triple tiara, who is giving the document of approval to the Bishop of Caen, who is the facilitator of the university, the creation of the University of Caen in Normandy. And going back to the issue of local universities, which are a bit provincial, which are very much project of the local ruler, we go to your quintessential new university, Wittenberg, which was founded by the Duke of Saxony in 1502, and became extremely famous because that is where Martin Luther got his job as a lecturer in theology. I'm tempted to just stop and say the rest of history is history, but I shan't, because he went to university. So look at that city. So it has the castle, it has the big ducal chapel, it has obviously it's a trading town. It's a little trading town amongst those hills. But it's surrounded by a lot of agricultural land. So it's fairly provincial. But what I think it must be the first university admissions handbook, what might be named that, was composed about this university in order to describe its many charms so that students will come to it. So it's like a book written as a dialogue between the student Reinhard, who's local, and he's showing Meinhard around. Meinhard is like considering which university to go to on a sort of open day. So he describes, you know, why Wittenberg is this great place to come to, and he mentions, amongst other things, that there's this great relic collection. This is true, 12,000 items of relics were in this collection. There are indulgences and all sorts of spiritual rewards related to them in the chapel. So if you're a student in the city, you'll benefit from it. There are plenty of bathhouses, and I shall allow you to think of bathhouses, yes, as places where you bath in order to be clean and healthy, but also other types of activities, and many perfume shops. Oh, and recently all the Jews were kicked out, so that makes it a great place to come to. And the colleges are in the city, but also close to this bucolic countryside. So it's sort of an exchange where the sort of Meinhard says, oh, ask these questions, and Reinhard, you know, shows what a great place it is to come to. So I'm going to stop there in terms of the trajectory of the medieval universities, not because I could stand here for hours and hours and talk about it, but that is not what we're here to do. What we're here is just to reflect through an historical sort of exemplum, or a set of historical exempla on this perennial engagement with some fundamental issues related to higher education. And the reason I think it's important is, and we just reflect a little bit historically, there are those who go about and say, oh, it's terrible in universities now, oh, all this management, all this preoccupation with funding. Let people just float around and just study and do what they want when they want it. It used to be like that when I was young, so they say. There cannot be a time when that was true. There cannot be a time when that is true. Universities fundamentally, and you see why, need care and nurture and support and funding and provision and whatnot. And because what they provide is so fundamental, not only to the lives lived there, but also to the greater good of societies. So in that sense, we ought to equip ourselves to understand how in different periods the challenges faced at a particular time were addressed. I think that's a bit more constructive than reflecting on sort of golden ages that I doubt very much ever existed. One can talk about specific things. Yes, it was great when students didn't pay £9,000. Yes, absolutely. It was great also when people had a modicum of through maintenance grants and so on, of security, and they could concentrate on their study rather than like so many of my students who are working far too many hours every day. But even those solutions, the £9,000, the graduate tax and so on, tax has to be understood exactly like we try to understand these universities as a question of choices and priorities and leadership. So I shall stop for the moment and we maybe can have an interesting conversation. Thank you. Anybody?
Miri, can I?
Yes. And then you.
I like your list very much, and when you first showed it, I thought maybe there were two things missing. First was the question of the extent to which students determine their educational provision. You covered that very nicely in talking about Romania. The other one, though, I wonder whether it's still missing, and that's the extent to which universities have been considered as places to extend learning, extend knowledge, as opposed to transmit it. And of course, you saw that played out in later centuries in the John Henry Newman versus Humboldt approaches. Do you think this has been a perennial debate, or is this something that we've become fixated on relatively recently?
I would have thought that on the whole there is a major change. That is, with the coming of sort of modernity, and what we used to call modernity, but in any case issues of knowledge about, particularly in the areas of science. You know, you can do science, you can develop really interesting techniques for the use of, I don't know, in metallurgy, in a relatively small workshop in a well-provided city. The projects of science become so overwhelming because of technological change, I think, that it became absolutely clear. It's quite interesting because the argument in the 19th century why to have the Cavendish, to develop the Cavendish laboratories in Cambridge, it was, everybody said, oh, this is going to be terrible to have these big laboratories that are university-wide. It'll take away, it'll detract from the autonomy of the colleges and the way they teach and the way they nurture. Of course it has. It has. It absolutely had to. But otherwise, how could you do what they did there? Similarly in, obviously, I mean, you know more about this than I do, of course, being a scientist yourself. But it seems to me that there were projects of learning that simply required this sort of harnessing of so much capital and so much intricate knowledge and support. It's hard to imagine how it could happen otherwise. But it's a really interesting question. But a lot of the issues, for example, so let's say science since the 19th century is very much driven and related to projects of state formation and empire building, etc. But in the 16th and 17th century, there was also massive new expertise going into all sorts of areas of, killing machines and, killing materials. And it was still possible to contain them within traditional frameworks of sort of artisanal craft organization. And clearly, after a certain point, that was simply not possible to do. But that's extremely interesting. But I would say about what is the university for, that this vision, this sort of like almost like national general good university thing is there from very, very early on. Paris is seen as a massive jewel for the King of France and for the Kingdom of France. It's not for nothing that people come. So that idea that it's an important national project is sort of there, except the nation doesn't have the same resonance or the same wherewithal to provide the sort of support until later on. But the notion that it's greater than just some sort of local institution and that its benefits spread really widely because, every priest who's trained in Paris goes to some parish in God knows where and spreads something of what he has learned. So that from very early on is seen as a general good, not just accruing to the person, or in a way accruing very little to the person, that's spreading far, far beyond. And that's partly because of the vision of the church. It's so much behind it. But that's an interesting question. Is there sort of learning for which you can only do in universities? And also, I would say that for some very charismatic and brilliant and forward-thinking people, obviously, they don't pop up everywhere or very frequently. So when they get a reputation, people do almost anything to go and hear them. And then you have to accommodate them, because what's clear in Paris is it was just not sustainable. All these sort of bits of education happening around, people coming in the city, not clear what their status is, where they dwell, who's in charge of them. So it's partly also the charisma. It's not just the science and the technology. It's also the charisma in a way that creates that encourage those early experiments with the new forms. It's nice to be able to maintain something of a sort of teaching and charisma in our story, rather than systematizing it and making it an institutional story only. Sorry, there was a gentleman.
We're not such a deep questions. You did mention the word research, and I'm trying to think now when research became part of the remit of universities, and I spoke more in linking it to hospitals, where they were just treating patients, but all of a sudden they became research centres into manners of medicine. And I just want to get any insights on, was it always a research-led?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's research and there's research. So, for example, in order to receive a degree, a PhD, you didn't write a dissertation, not until the 18th century, late 17th, 18th century. You didn't write a piece of writing. But you had to be able to get up and defend quite, over hours, a set of arguments by the deployment of texts. Now, that's not exactly research, I agree, but that isn't research. But in the course of it, if some new interpretations arise, isn't that research? Although they wouldn't call it research. Do you see what a new way of seeing the world, in a way, that's research. So, and then when that got written up, that becomes part of the knowledge that's available around, and then the next person who does it. So there is this question of accumulation, of the survival of the best, perhaps, or the most compelling commentaries and comments on shared knowledge. But again, it's connected with Simon's question, actually, because if you look at the hospitals, most of the people researching there were not university people, not till quite late. And in the College of Surgeons is a 16th century creation. It was much debated as to whether even it deserved to have a guild status, let alone to be taught in university. So, and what's something I should have perhaps said is that we think learning is great, everybody in this room, of course, but it's very striking that on the whole, aristocrats did not send their children until very late to university. So what you needed to be an aristocrat to inherit, to function, to run your estate, you didn't need to go to university for at all. But it's around the sort of 17th and 18th centuries when the whole issue of refinement, when war and nastiness is actually done by other people, and you have this sort of more, this process whereby gentility is displayed and experienced through manners and a certain type of cultivation, then it seemed to be compatible. But again, they lived very separately. It's like the Bullingdon Club. I mean, they lived, they socialized very, very separately. In fact, it's quite heartbreaking because often they employed poor students even as sort of, I mean, I'm not saying to do their homework for them, but like, you know, to write letters for them as to work for them. So there is that sort of rather creepy economy going on there as well. But again, I just want to add that universities were not the only place where knowledge was explored and were in that sense accumulated, because as you say, the craft guilds with their tremendous and also they have to teach it. They have to teach it because they have apprentices. So they're doing teaching all the time. They're doing teaching all the time, be it in metallurgy, be it in textile, be it in all sorts of, I mean, notaries. You don't study to be a notary at university, you study notary by being a notary with another notary. So there are quite a lot of arrays that we have absorbed into universities that, or at least in some places that have been absorbed in universities, that were taught in different ways. And it may well be that some of them would benefit from more hands-on, and that's why we get this whole thing about industry, science, people going to become scientists. They ought to have some experience actually hands-on in sort of industrial applications and so on. It's a very interesting question.
Sorry.
No,
Bringing up to date,
yes.
Students paying £9,000 a year. Those that don't become university students go into apprenticeships, maybe with a drug company, Big Pharma. And because Big Pharma has patenting needs, copyright needs, whatever the student helps develop becomes the company's copyright. Whereas students that go to universities don't necessarily get the same momentum. And I'm just wondering whether
How interesting.
that is a problem today.
That's interesting.
Maybe.
Why, I can't understand why that is in a way. I mean, presumably the people who train students in universities are aware of this problem and...
Well, maybe they're grooming them to go to those particular
I see.
outlets.
Yes.
So, a kind of grammatical question.
Mm-hmm.
So, we know the meaning of the word trivial, or at least we hope we know the meaning of the word trivial, right? So, I'm just curious.
Trivial.
Yes.
Yes, very good. I like to answer that question. Should we go back to it? It's hardly trivial, and I wouldn't even dare to send my students to a grammar or rhetoric or logic handbook from the Middle Ages. It would be far too taxing. But the idea trivial, what it means is, it is so basic and fundamental you don't even mention it. This is the fundament of everything. It's trivial because it goes without saying in the formation of an individual. But it's, as you say, quite rightly, it's gone through all these changes so that now it's, as it were, it's not mentioned, it's not important. It's because it's fundamental importance for any form of expression. And it's that sort of training we have to remember that still in a good grammar school like Shakespeare's, he got that training. So in rhetoric they would train in speaking in voices. So, you know, you take this speech, yes, we must go and attack Troy. No, we must not go and attack Troy. And in both cases, you're using your powers of reasoning, which you also get from your logic, and you express it rhetorically very persuasively so you can sway your band of fighters with you. So that's how it works. So they're sitting there in Stratford-upon-Avon and they're practicing these voices. And that's exactly what a playwright is. So it isn't trivial. Yes, Cecil?
You emphasised how every monarch was anxious to encourage the establishment of universities, however small, however big, how they require and sought papal validation and so on. And yet, talk about the trivium, which encouraged conversation, debate, questioning, reasoning, how come these were not centres of dissent rather than centres of orthodoxy?
There were sometimes centres of dissent. There were sometimes centres of dissent. And in fact, one of my friends once, well, this probably proves it's a very good question. Okay, there are two ways to answer your question. It's very important. One is to say that universities displayed all the varieties that existed, say, within the intellectual world on the whole at that given moment. Okay? So if there's a lot of debate, say, about the role of the Pope in the late 14th century, because there's a schism and there are 2 popes and there are 3 popes, so you have to decide, what a pope is and what he's for. Everyone's discussing it and taking different positions, and there's a civilized debate between them. Civilized in as much as long as it's not being declared as heretical, it's sayable. But what's also very interesting is, and I remember the day when I read this text, and it so struck me, and I always, maybe some of my students here have heard it from me, but it's really interesting. You get this theologian in 13th century Paris, very famous theologian, William of Auxerre, and he just tries to reflect on what is purgatory. And purgatory, what do you think is purgatory? It's fire, it's pain, it's all that. So this guy says, actually, purgatory is a higher level of suffering. It's a suffering when you confront your own fallibility, your own nullness, as it were. So he immediately asks, and he says, but of course, when preaching in a parish church, you shouldn't say these things to people. You should actually talk about fire and brimstone and so on. So I think they're very aware which audience they're talking to at what time, these highly trained men. They know what's appropriate for reflection amongst intellectuals. They also know what the big project of the church is, which is to produce priests who will do the right thing by their parishioners and remain within orthodoxy. But your question also makes me, it seems right, therefore, also to add that 2 things. One is that Oxford was rife with dissent in the late 14th century, and for a number of decades got no new endowments. It got such a bad reputation as being touched by a particular English heresy known as Lollady, Wycliffism, Lollady. Now, this particular heresy developed out of the theological writings of a master, a fellow of Balliol College, Merton Van Balliol, John Wycliffe, who was in every way respectable except for a few opinions that he had on the papacy and on the Eucharist, on the Mass. So he himself, he died in his bed, all was well, but his students took it to such extremes. They did not obey, as it were, the gentlemanly understanding of how far you go and where you speak about what. And they then became, a number of generations of them, became the subject of serious persecution by the state because it was an English form of heresy, and it started in Oxford. On the other hand, universities can also be planted in areas that are seen as touched particularly by heresy. So in the south of France with the Cathar heresy, that's when the University of Montpellier was planted, sort of trained people locally who could go out and put out fires. So universities are seen as places for debate, places for perhaps also intervening in debates. But as we all know, you can't keep scholars really silent for that long. And I have a friend who came to Oxford and he wanted to do a PhD on those scholars who fell foul of the University of Paris in the 13th, 14th centuries. And he found a lot of cases of people who were looked at or examined or troubled, but he didn't find anyone. He actually changed the subject of his PhD because he didn't have enough material. There weren't that many people who were fired or were they like to take the idea if you say something particularly about, say on virgin birth. There was a particular case, a person who sort of questioned virgin birth in a particular way, the virgin birth of Christ to his mother, and there's a trial. They want to put him right. They want to get it all, over with, as it were. So there are all sorts of mechanisms of discipline, absorption. And, Martin Luther himself, after the Holy Roman Emperor, and pronounced his opinions to be absolutely heretical, and the Pope, etc., he still lived in Wittenberg, in that little provincial haven, because who's going to come and get him? So it's that a really very, very broad array of possibilities, that there's fermentation of thought all the time, there's no doubt about that. But how it's contained, where its influence is very diverse. And confident kings also don't mind that. The most of the tension around ideas is between the scholars. It's not that somebody comes from outside. It's between the Franciscans and the non-Franciscans, the University of Paris. It's between the scholars about way to understand and way to express. And particularly when on religious issues it can get extremely heated. But cases of really coming down heavily are very few. Yes?
It seems to me that the medieval universities started off with the trivium and quadrivium and law and theology, and then it expanded into all sorts of other subjects, some of which it stole from the guilds. So what drove that expansion to other subjects, and what sort of battles were there with the guilds in acquiring them, so they should be taught in universities rather than...
Well, as we said just now in response to the first two questions, that happened quite sort of late in the day, when even guilds themselves were becoming sort of, not just vis-a-vis universities, but in general a way of organizing, when you have factories and mills arising, etc. The whole issue of guild is a form of organization of knowledge and production and training, etc., was under quite a lot of pressure, I think, from many quarters. And although we value many of its characteristics, it was one clearly on the wane in North and Western Europe from about the 18th century, and definitely in the 19th century. We like when we can take away from the guild system, we like the issue of mutuality, which of course is related also to the development of unions and of sort of mutual security, and the issue of deep training, etc. But it was already, I think, on the wane in terms of providing the quick turnaround of trained people that were needed in a whole lot of areas, where the technology was also changing. And the thing is, technology, well, it's Karl Marx 101. It's sort of really basic. It's the accumulation of capital. So you have to have everything on massive scales. But that is why we now, when we say, oh, it's artisanal, it's guild-like, etc., that's to us, it's a massive. And some areas of the world, like even in Italian cities today, a lot of the added value is because it's made in that fashion. But on the whole, for a good 150 years, the world delighted in having cheap and cheerful and easily and quickly produced and much circulating and much exported goods, didn't they? I think it must be part of that story. It'd be really interesting to have a lecture about that from one of our colleagues who does more modern things. Were you asking something?
Yeah, so
and then you...
I'm really interested in the transition between
Thank you for coming.
The main student activity being and speaking, and the transition to writing, and how that happened, why that happened, why did we go back? I guess, did it happen across the board, like across the whole of Europe at the same time? Was it all part of the same movement?
I think the emphasis on the oral, don't forget, still in the 1960s they were doing oral exams in Oxford. So the emphasis on the oral is very, very long-standing, because that's ultimately how you're going to have to do it. I know my stepson is a barrister. He had to do a lot of these sort of, mock trials and whatnot, where you don't have them. You have to get up and you have to talk. You can think of a lot of areas of life where that would be really, really useful. And there are other also skills like analyzing a sick person. That's not writing. That's sort of, yes, you have to write later, but basically it's about seeing, it's about touching, it's about smelling, and so on. So there are all sorts of different ways of accumulating knowledge, but I must say that you're right, that in the humanities, probably the issue of the writing did take over, of the writing down, and particularly writing these enormous dissertations, these vast dissertations. We now, 80,000 words, or is it 100,000? 100, yeah, you're just finishing yours. I mean, you know, the French ones, we're talking thousands and thousands of pages, the German ones, enormous. So there was a sort of inflation around that as a form of big is good. But to go back to the medieval, which is a very interesting question, a lot of the testing was totally oral, because you had to get up and you had to dispute. And also, I should say, there is a real, they really believed in memorizing. They really believed in memorizing. There's a whole machine, a whole world of memory and memorization, which Mary Carruthers has written beautifully about, how you use your fingers and how you use your knuckles, etc., as mnemonics in all sorts of interesting ways, which actually we would do well to know more about. And I think actors use and performers use more because they have to. So that was retained for a long time. But I think what was always written down, and indeed as I showed you in that page, was the knowledge that had to be transported. So even as these lecturers were lecturing orally and then the students would be tested orally, there was a market in notes from their lectures, because people who couldn't get in, people who were interested because of other reasons, issues of record, issues of collection. The bishop wants to have anything smart that's said about theology, even if he isn't there to hear it. And also there's a real interface here with preaching. Preaching, afterwards, just a massive activity in this period. And there again, preaching, you get up, you know what you're going to talk about. You don't have notes in front of you. The great preachers did not. They could go on for hours. Partly because their memory was organized in the way we just mentioned, but also we also know that people took reportaciones, little reports. And it's the same word that's used for the reports that were taken from lectures in university and the reports that were taken from preaching, because these are public performances that are so extraordinary, you really want to take notes of them so others can benefit, or indeed for commercial exploitation. So even the issue of the interaction between the oral and the written, it's so interesting just from what you've raised here. But obviously, once printing is introduced from the later part of the 15th century, it's so cheap to make books and to have books and to use them as points of reference. And also there are new texts that are coming in and challenging humanistic texts, which again, texts that talk about the new worlds that are being discovered all around. And the world becomes so vast and so large that I would have thought that that's how partly, and with the more and more subjects that are covered, that is how ultimately, because medieval libraries, university libraries, college libraries, those that have survived, we know from lists, they aren't enormous. They aren't enormous. There's no cortex, and you go back to them and you learn a lot, etc. And then they totally explode. And the coming of print must be part of that story. Thank you. Such an interesting question.
I'm interested in a theme that came up in the final slide, Jared. You don't need to bring it up again. It's the one that's referring to student support and then the moral versus academic. It's interested me coming to British universities from places somewhat far away, that the notion of personal tutoring has gone from something that's very much an ecclesiastical base. I mean, the notion of pastoral care, good shepherd.
We use the word pastoral.
Well, that's exactly the point. And I'm just interested in trying to track through that notion and the heritage of the current practices of personal tutoring, which, since I never experienced it myself in another system, still persist, but to some degree have lost their way. They don't, in a secular age and secular university, the notion of personal tutoring is somewhat cast adrift from the religious background to these things and the need, and it comes up in this business of personal support, academic versus moral, and stuff like that. So I'm just interested where those points of disconnection may have occurred. And
I'm not sure where they occurred, but they were definitely very much there in the ancient, in the universities that adhere to their ancient modes. early on. I would guess that the more modern universities, I mean the 19th century foundations, etc., which are bigger, which are not in a collegiate system, which reflect rationality and utilitarianism, etc., and also, quite frankly, which are liberal, which let the individual be and not constantly be interfered with and asked and this hour and that hour and curfew and whatnot. You know, if you went to UCL in the 19th century, you're treated like an adult. And very soon on, you know, even women were treated like adults there. So I think the vision is quite important here. These are, as you say, ecclesiastical institutions, over which is then laid the whole issue of the college and its ethos, and the fact that you are a grateful recipient of charity within that system. So you have to toe the line. Sorry, I'm sure that wasn't your experience in Cambridge last year, Julia. I'm sort of like aware that I'm not talking about people's lives here. But that's a very interesting point. So these modern 19th century universities were about individuals. They come, they study. Yes, they have to be not act in a way that brings the institution into disrepute, but basically it doesn't interfere with people so much in terms of their choices. I think there's a reinvention of pastoral care, and I definitely know my school is one of the only schools in the university that has a full-time student experience manager. And he's a very busy man. It's not as if he doesn't have what to do. But what we have, I suppose, with the massive extension of higher education since the Education Act in the 40s, is the bringing in of people who are coming from backgrounds that have not perhaps prepared them in the same way, people who have a lot of different types of responsibilities, the whole issue of course, adult learners, returning learners. None of this existed in that. So how do we support people? How do we support people who, you know, come from very, very different backgrounds? I mean, that's what we find. We find in our care, and he doesn't like the word pastoral, by the way, nor does he like the word support, because support suggests that there's some sort of failing. He's educating us, our student experience manager, but he's terrifically sympathetic to the variety of situations. But the argument is also that you have to have, for good learning, you have to have the person coming with a fresh mind, with some time to invest into it, to not have other troubles on their mind. And in that sense, we go back to the very first question, which is, this is the formative age. This is, if you get it right, you get it so right. And if you don't get it right, you're missing out. But I must say, even amongst our students, I know, and this is a source of great frustration to this absolutely inspirational guy who's holding this job, there are some who just don't want all this attention. They just want to get on with things. They just don't want to be, oh, come for a gathering here and come for a drink there, and oh, and come and schmooze with the history journal. No, they have their life and they don't need it. So I suppose it's there because some people benefit most particularly from it, but you have to make it available to all. I agree with you that it's tricky because we're dealing with adults here, or are we dealing with adults? The whole issue of age is very interesting. These students were 14, 15. If we talk about capacity, if we talk about independence, etc., you know, this has also changed historically over time. And the age gets later and later in higher, what we call higher education, which is anachronistic, really, what I'm saying. But the education that comes after the learning of Latin. So it is interesting and it is challenging, but there is a link to the academic function. That's why the government is interested in it. That's why there are funds in order to improve retention and this and that. It's not just the issue of outreach and social justice, which is of course issues that are peripheral in the period I've just discussed. Although there are many of the founders will say, I'm founding this because there are poor boys who are very talented who can't get to universities. So there's awareness that you have to bring the talent in. But it's not major national projects on social justice. That won't arrive until the 20th century in the welfare state. But when you bring them in, then what do they need in order to make the best, to maximize of this opportunity? And that's the language also of utility, which is so fundamental to all of the services that the modern state provides. The state is investing how best to make that work. So it wouldn't just be, it's not very nice to have unhappy students around, let's try and make them happier or more satisfied or able to cope. But it's also about what sort of experience will they have? How can they study if they have so much else on their mind, I think. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for your convincing and brilliant lecture.
Oh, thank you.
I have two very simple questions. You described that there is, France and the Normandy. I think when I was young, when I studied, Normandy belong to the France, isn't it? But as if independent country, blah blah, and then England, United Kingdom, and then Germany, Lufthansa. And then secondly, why the Sorbonne, the university, the Sorbonne is why La Sorbonne? Why don't you say El Sorbonne? That is, I wanted to be.
Oh,
yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, you don't know? You're French.
Sorry, you asked why?
Yeah, why?
We call it the...
Yeah, French people say La Sorbonne. Why don't they don't say El Sorbonne? That is, I don't understand.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking something else about Normandy. Oh, no, La Sorbonne, because it's...
Sorbonne.
They call it La Sorbonne,
yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Le Collège, La Sorbonne. It's a college. So why is it called? That's a very good question.
Why don't you say El Sorbonne?
No, you would say Le. You would say Le. Sorbonne? I don't really know.
Is it Bonne Sœur or something? Is it
No, it shouldn't be. It must be La something. Oh, well.
My daughter studied Sorbonne, so she told me La Sorbonne. You also know.
She's right.
Oh, really?
She's right, but I don't know why she's right. But thank you. We've reached the end of our time. I don't want to impose on people's will.
Yes, I think that's come to the end of the time. Well, thank you very much, Miri.
It's my pleasure.
Very, very fascinating.
Great questions.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you for organising it.